Good morning, make-it-yourselfers. Today I'm going to show you how to make tallow. In the past, I already showed how to make lard on the blog. Lard was really easy for me to make because here in Spain it's quite easy to get your hands on some pork fat. A piece of like the fat back with the skin and the fat on it. It's called tocino here, and it's served in one of their popular dishes, which is the Valencian puchero. So I can usually buy quite a few little pieces of that. It's maybe not the ideal leaf fat, but it makes a good lard, especially for cooking and making things like mantecados and cooking your meats. But I had a really hard time getting a hold of beef fat. And I really wanted to make tallow. Tallow is great for cooking, it's great for making soaps, it's great for skincare. The fats are so much similar to our own fats so that it absorbs really well into the skin, but I was able to get a hold of this. It was a butcher that actually saved the fat for me. They actually saved it for a friend of a friend who has a restaurant and who is always ordering beef from the same place, and they were happy to send him the scraps. Obtaining the fat is probably the hardest part, but you should be able to talk to butchers or try to find someone who knows somebody who can get a hold of this. And I've heard of some people who, just their grocery stores, they sometimes will give them the fat that they trim away from the other pieces. So if you let them know, they'll save it for you throughout the day, and then you can pick it up at night, and a lot of times they'll just give it to you for free because they were going to throw it away anyways. I am going to open this up now. This is nice and vacuum sealed. Should be nice and fresh still. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be cutting off most of the pieces that have the meat. And I'm going to separate those bits. I'll still try to get the fat from those, but I'm gonna use the pieces that are mostly fat here in the soaking. And then these other pieces of meat, here's like a large piece. I'm going to render those separately to see if I can salvage some of the meat for use at home. I actually got 2 of these bags, and the other day I already rendered the first batch. And I rendered separately, I cooked directly in the crock pot any pieces that had meat with them. And that gave me a little bit darker tallow, but not much. It was still quite white, especially in comparison to a tallow that I obtained from another place that I sourced online. And they sent me partially rendered fat. Now I say partially rendered because it still had bits of meat and everything, so I had to re-melt it down, and I was able to strain out the pieces of meat in there. These are the tallows that I obtained. This bright white tallow I obtained from this fat, from the younger beef. And then this was from a wagyu. You can see it's yellower. I've studied it a little bit since then, and I've learned that not only does it depend on the age of the animal, but it's also, their diet, if they are eating grass-fed, which both of these are grass-fed, but as they age, they'll obtain more of the pigments. And this is basically beta-carotene that is obtained from eating plants. Now you can find yellower tallow that is also from cattle that have been raised with corn. But in this case, I'm pretty sure that's not what's going on here. This is from grass, and this is just a little bit older animal than this one. The other day I made some tallow deodorant, which is absolutely wonderful, and I'll be sharing that in the blog soon. But I also want to try making some tallow candles, some tallow creams, and just see what else I can make with it. Made some tallow soap. I made 100% tallow soap, actually, but now I want to make a more balanced soap for those who want more lather and bubbliness. So I will be doing that too. I'm going to continue to separate this out, and I'll show you once I have it mostly ready. Here you could see that I was rinsing some of the pieces of fat, and I changed the water a few times before I ended up filling it with ice. Ice was what was recommended to us by the people who sent me the fat. So I kept it in ice for an hour or so, and then you can see that quite a bit of darker liquid came from it. I took the clean pieces of fat and I decided to grind them up in my food processor to see if it would render more quickly. In the end, it was easier to just use a strainer to get those pieces. You can see the water was quite dark. I tried cooking this batch in a regular pot with water, and I added a little bit of salt because I had read in several places that that would help make a more purified, white, hard tallow. I didn't really find that to be the case. In fact, I found that no matter how hard I tried to cook off the water, I ended up with some behind, leaving behind a grainy, softer tallow. But here I am cooking it with the water, and I can show you the results of that. But then here's another batch that I cooked of the pieces of fat that had a little bit more meat to them. And I figured this would make a darker tallow, but it actually wasn't too bad. And you can see that I just cut up the pieces of fat, even if they had meat on them, and I cooked them in my slow cooker. Here you can see both batches side by side. Now this one should be very white and bright because I purified it with water and salt, and this was just more fat than there was barely any meat to it. On the other hand, this other batch should give a darker tallow because I have cooked it without salt, without the water, and it has a lot of meat on it. And while you can see a difference in the colors of the liquid fat obtained, once they cool off and solidify, there's not a huge difference. I experimented with a lot of different combinations. This was the wagyu fat that I remelted with water, but I found it was so difficult to even get it to melt that way, especially in the slow cooker with water, that I ended up having to use my immersion blender to blend it up and get it cooking. Here you can see two bowls with the hardened tallow on the top, and the bottom you can see more of like a gelatin, the liquid, anything that was water soluble that fell to the bottom with the so-called impurities. Now I'm going to be removing this tallow. In this case, you can see that the liquid underneath is quite liquid. If you put it in the fridge, you might get more of a gelatin. I'm straining it into a jar so that I can use it to add to broths and other things. And I clean off some of that liquid gelatin so that I have a cleaner fat. I will be remelting this though to try to purify it. I had put this other batch in the fridge before trying to separate it, and you can see I have quite a thick gelatin layer underneath. Now that I have obtained some of this fat, I've strained it just with the stainless steel strainer into this bowl. I actually like the metal ones better because they're a little bit more flexible and it makes it a little bit easier to get the fat out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start to separate this by running a knife around the edge, and then see if I can pop this out. Now this is a pretty heavy duty stainless steel bowl, so it's a little bit harder to separate it out. Okay, I'm going to use a spoon to run underneath. You'll see I'm breaking out bits of fat. These were the last bits of tallow that I got from the fat that was left, and you'll see that there's not as much liquid underneath. I was able to pop this out and see how the liquid is not running off. This was because this was very gelatinous, what's left. In fact, you can see I can pull it off in a piece and it's quite solid. First I'm going to cut off the gelatin and then I'll scrape off the rest. So you can see I'm cutting all of this off. I'm going to save it. I really love that part. But now to keep our tallow on the purer side, I'm going to start cutting this off. Okay, now what's left, I am going to slice and add to the rest of the fat. And you'll notice that this part isn't completely white either. While most of the impurities will sink to the bottom with the liquids, you'll notice that some will actually float on top, forming kind of a skin over the top of your fat. So if you really want this to be nice and pure for making creams and soaps, it's not a bad idea to scrape this part off too. You'll see how it's gotten quite a bit cleaner looking now. I will be adding these to the rest of the fat to boil down again, or to melt down, and to filter one last time. Now that I've obtained this mostly clean tallow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to melt this down. Now if I were to want to further purify this, I could heat this down, melt it down once more with a little bit more water and a little bit more salt, and allow it to just bring out the rest of the gelatin and other impurities. As I hinted at earlier, I didn't find much benefit to cooking the suet with salt and water. What I did find though was that if I could keep continuing to simmer the tallow, I could get it to form a skin of gelatin on top of the surface, and I could remove that. I found that to be a great way to purify the tallow. What I would do is I would simmer it until a foam would form on the top, and then I would allow it to cool, and that would make a solid skin that I could remove, and I could even remove it with my hands. And I continued that process of simmering until I removed all of the gelatin and other impurities. I'm just going to melt this down once, and what I will do is I will fold this up so that I have about 4 layers of cheesecloth, and I'll add that to my funnel and then make sure that I get out any little bits of meat that could be remaining in this. Now you can also use a coffee filter. I've done that and it does a pretty good job filtering anything out too. It does take a little bit longer to filter through, but it actually filters out much more quickly than I expected. I've tried filtering out homemade soy sauce and it takes so much longer than this. So I guess this is already pretty pure and it goes through pretty quickly. I'm gonna melt this down and then show you as I start ladling it into here. In this case, I am doing the final filtration into a silicone soap mold that's more of a loaf shape. And I found this to be a great way to store excess homemade tallow. You can see once it's solidified, I was able to pull it out into blocks. It's easier to unmold the blocks of tallow if you freeze it first. I then vacuum sealed the excess blocks and have them stored in my freezer. For easy use for cooking, I just pour the tallow into a small jar that I keep by the stove, and then I use that for cooking meats and other recipes. Here's the finished tallow. I hope you enjoyed this recipe and that you'll give it a try. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and I would love for you to subscribe to my channel. And see you next time.